let's talk about Lord of the Hollow Dark by Russell Kirk. This is, to quote the back, an uncanny story of adventure and mystery, a journey of grace through eternal darkness. It was written or published in 1979. Russell Kirk was also an author of many things. He's a cultural critic, but particularly in the realm of fiction, he was a publisher of ghost stories, and I've reviewed some of his ghost stories elsewhere on the channel. I'll probably link that at the end. And the basic setup to this novel, he wrote 3 novels as well. This was the last of the 3 novels he wrote. The basic setup is there's this weird spiritual ritual going on in a Scottish country house, and whose previous owner was also an occultist of some kind. So it's been hired out by this new cult, partly out of interest in the previous owner's occult activities. All the characters take names from the poetry of T.S. Eliot. Kirk wrote one of the definitive criticism books on Eliot, and Eliot himself was a friend of Kirk's and thought that Kirk understood his poetry very well. So this is, though this is long after Eliot's death, it's an interesting thing that it's, at least at some level, a response to Eliot. Now, there are a bunch of groups or individuals who gather to take part in this ritual, or to whatever in this ritual. So first, there is the main group of disciples and acolytes, 12 disciples, 12 acolytes. The acolytes are kind of junior servants, and they are led by their master, Mr. Apollinax, who is a charismatic, I suppose, religious leader who is promising his attendees a timeless moment, an occult moment of transcendence if they take part in his ritual. That's the central purpose, and that's set up very early, that they are meeting to have this occult moment. There is Apollinax's advisor, kind of occult advisor, particularly a figure going by the name Archvicar Gorontian, along with his group of servants. He comes with 3 of his own servants as well. There is a young woman going by the name of Mariner, a character from an Eliot poem, who has a baby, Michael, and they have been invited to join as special guests for the ritual that's going to happen. They've got a special part in the ritual. There's a rather brutish, cynical fellow called, he's a kind of a servant, or a fixer. He's not a servant, he's a fixer of Apollinax's, called Sweeney, and he's procured drugs for Apollinax before. He has probably done some other rather nasty business for Apollinax. And finally, there's a vagrant who basically literally falls into the situation, who is dubbed Coriolan. This is just what's in the dust cover, and these characters come together for this ritual. And obviously a bad thing is afoot. What it is unclear. How it connects to the occult history of the property, Balgrumo House, is unclear. All we know is that Mariner, a relative innocent, is caught up in it, and she thinks that she's going to achieve some kind of release and peace. She is an ex-nun who has had a baby, and she fell in love with someone, had a baby with him. He has abandoned her, and though she loves her baby, she feels very alone in the world. And so this timeless moment would be an escape and release. Now, a lot of the book is about the mystery of Balgrumo House and the occult interests of Mr. Apollinax and the factional interplay of the different people. And I can't really get into that, obviously, without spoiling the story. It's a mystery book, and so you can't really say very much about what happens later on. But there's plenty to say about the book in general terms. So first, it's an enjoyable, readable, quirky book. The characters are all well drawn. The basic plot and mysteries are fascinating. The atmosphere is usually, nearly always, excellently realised and drawn. Because this isn't a spooky short story as with Kirk's own short stories. This is a development of the genre from kind of ghost story to, well, he calls it a supernatural romance, I think. And the atmosphere developed is different. There are shades of anxiety, which are different to, oh no, it's a ghost about to pop up, but more a general background anxiety. There is this sort of confusion of the wheels within wheels of the different schemes going on. There is a growing awareness of something very bad and horrible going on. And that, that this kind of sense of when are the awful things going to start happening? I wouldn't call it horror in the way we generally think of horror. That would probably be not the right way to put it. Though it ends up having some, it has elements of the true horror genre where the horror is existential and internal, reflected in external matters rather than, oh, it's there to be scary. There are weaknesses. That's the second thing. The pace is a little uneven, partly because in the longer format, Kirk has to deal with more types of scene, more types of action, and he can't rely on the compression of the short story. He was a master of the short story, undoubtedly a master of the short story, and part of the gift needed for the short story is a gift of compression, but the kind of expansion of the novel is the opposite of that. And though he wrote 3 novels, he was no amateur. He's not as focused here as in the short stories. And there is this one specific issue of repetition, which I think is worth mentioning now. There's an important structural plot point about the caverns beneath the country house. And it is quite important to know what's going on and some of the relative geography involved, because this is something which everyone's interested in from the off. Now, there is kind of an explanation of what's going on with that and the geography about 4 times in a shortish book. That is, I think, probably too much. And I think it's basically that Kirk didn't want the audience, his readers, to end up thinking, wait, where are they? What's happening? What are they trying to get to? Why are they interested in this place underneath? What's the history? Why are they talking about an old laird from the kind of Renaissance period? And you can see that, basically, you can see that that would be very frustrating too. So erring on the side of caution may be better, but it was probably too often brought up. Third, it's a discussion and a thinking book, like the short stories are discussion and thinking stories. So a couple of comparisons for what I mean. One is C.S. Lewis. Another, I recently reviewed a book by Frank Herbert. Herbert was interested in talking about things, and he used speculative fiction to do so. And I mean, lots of authors are like that, of course, but there's more and less focused authors. You know, so there's some people who are most interested in almost simply human characteristics, whereas others are interested in a different set of questions, wider sets of questions, perhaps. So there are obvious questions on the table in this novel. The nature of decision and of freedom and of, I guess, transcendence, what those things are and what different people think they are. They're not always given simple answers. Kirk has views, he wants to explore them in fictional prose, but he is willing to kind of sometimes open up and say, well, how do we answer this question? Obviously, the answers he assays will appeal or not to different people at different levels, just like Frank Herbert's answers will, about human history and about ecology will appeal to different people differently. But generally, he engages in this discussion, in these topics, entertainingly and thoughtfully. And so I think most people will enjoy it, even when they're like, I actually think something different on that question. And fourth, I guess finally for the points I want to bring up, this is a culmination really to the work of his short stories. This is a culmination to the short stories. This draws together thoughts, ideas, situations, discussions from across the short stories and ties them together. For instance, this is a non-spoiler example because some of these things are like, oh, if you know the short stories, you're like, oh, he's kind of playing on this thing from this short story. But here is a non-spoiler example. Apollinax's cult meeting is held at Balgrimo House, or Balgrimo Place actually I think it's called, which is the subject of a short story, Balgrimo's Hell, which in a later edition, not this edition, in the reprint, is a prologue, is added as a prologue because it's obviously so relevant. You don't have to read Balgrimo's Hell to read this, but you'll benefit from reading it. And similarly, I think that's true for other stories. So in that sense, it is a standalone. It is not something which you have to read anything else to read, but it is, if you like, a capstone to Kirk's short ghost story work. He still published a few very good short stories after this in the early 80s. This nonetheless feels like an intentional capstone, an intentional conclusion to his fictional work. He's trying to gather his spooky fictional universe, his shared universe, together into a longer form and explore some of the themes he's explored elsewhere in much more depth. About guilt, about grace, about transcendence, about the nature of reality, things like that. So I do recommend this book. I heartily recommend it, though, for those who like ghost stories, for those who like Kirk's short stories, some of which you can find online, by the way. For those interested in atmospheric books, in thoughtful books. If you're getting into Kirk, I would probably recommend reading at least some of the short stories first, but partly, and as I say, there are some online, and the latest collection of them was in a book called Ancestral Shadows, but you can find some for free online, including audio recordings by Kirk and others. I'd read those first, partly to get a feel for the atmosphere and the style, and partly because if you like them, then I think, one, you'll enjoy reading the stories, but also they will make reading this finally a much more satisfying experience, I think. I also recommend it because, I want to discuss it in detail with people. There is so much going on here. This is a really deep and dense and interesting novel, with its strengths and its weaknesses, sure, but it's a fascinating novel and it's not been read by enough people, so I heartily recommend it, partly so I have people to talk to about it. If you have read it, then tell me what you think in the comments, or if you've read any of Kirk's other works, let's talk about it in the comments. Till next time.